Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be looking at a game from 102 years ago, played in St. Petersburg, 1914, and it is a game between Nimzowitsch, who was white, and Tarrasch, who was black, and this opening is actually the Tarrasch defence, so hopefully Tarrasch it doesn't go wrong in the game we're about to see. It'd be a bit embarrassing going wrong in the opening named after you. And what we'll be looking at today is combinations and recognizing certain patterns in chess. So to kick off, white started with d4, Tarrasch answered d5, knight f3, c5, c4, e6, e3, and mirror, knight f6. So already black is signalling that he isn't going to hold back and he's going to be quite, maybe not aggressive, although perhaps using that word isn't completely wrong, but he's not going to let white gain the initiative easily. He's going to try and fight to stay level and not allow himself to be defensive here and go on the back foot, which I admire. I like that. So white now plays bishop d3, knight c6, castles kingside, bishop d6, b3, castles, bishop b2, b6, knight d2, and bishop b7. So here the position is basically symmetrical, except for the fact that black's knight on c6 is more central than white's counterpart on d2, so that's the positive. On the negative side, white's bishop on b2 has more range and more control of the centre than black's bishop on b7, because black's knight is interfering with black's bishop. So perhaps you could say black's pieces are very slightly uncoordinated, but that's only temporary. Usually black's knight will then move, and then the bishop will be just as effective as white's bishop. But it's an interesting start to the game. There's a lot of tension in the centre, so and every pawn capture there's at least two ways of recapturing, so that could be interesting to see how the middle game develops in the pawn structure and the placement of the pieces. So here rook c1 is played, so trying to improve the pieces and complete development. Queen e7, that's the move I would have played as white actually, queen e2, to connect the rooks. So after that, c takes d5 was played. And now if pawn takes was played, but if knight takes, it does feel like you're giving up part of the centre, because white will then have what's called a small centre with two central pawns on the d and e files against one central pawn on e6. And what can often happen there is that the white pawns, in combination with the white pieces, can overwhelm the centre and take a very aggressive stance and control a lot of squares. So black takes with the pawn to make the pawn move forward and gain a bit of space. Still has a slightly small centre, but it's harder for white to break with e4. Knight h4 was now played, and this is quite a good pattern to recognise. You might think, what is white doing here? Knights on the rim aren't very good. But again, white is, if he can, white will try and get knights onto the 5th rank, particularly f5 and c5. There seem to be some of the strongest squares you can have for a knight. The two central squares of e5 and d5 are also very, very good. But f5 can be very annoying because it adds lots of pressure to the king side and it could aid in the attack. So black weakens his pawn structure with g6 to stop the white knight, and having achieved a weakening of black's structure, white retreats to f3. And here, again, I don't mind black's position so much. Black seems to have a slight space advantage now because of his 2 pawns on the 5th rank, whereas white only has 1 pawn on the 5th rank. So black has a tiny bit more space to maneuver his pieces. It might not be a big factor, but it's quite nice to see that black isn't getting squashed here. Black has what could be argued is a small initiative. Rook a d8 is played, and again, as I won't dwell on it too long, but again, putting your rook on the same line as your opponent's queen can often result in favourable tactics. Pawn takes, and black chooses hanging pawns here. Nothing particularly wrong with it. I would have done that because otherwise black would have an isolated queen's pawn, which can be problematic. And also, I like keeping my bishop on the b8 to h2 diagonal. The black's 2 bishops are quite well connected in terms of they're both pointing in the direction of the white king. So potentially black might be able to do a kingside attack, but they're also pieces are very central. So black's 2 pawns gaining space in the centre also set up black's pieces for a good central skirmish. So white now plays a move I wouldn't play here, bishop b5. To be honest, I can't really see why Nimzowitsch has played this. I would have probably played rook e1 or queen e2, just getting my queen off the back rank and connecting my rooks. Rook e1 is also good, and then maybe queen c2 instead. I would like to go to d2 actually with my queen, but my knight is unfortunately tangling me up a little. But yeah, so I would do that instead of bishop b5. It just moves a piece you've already moved and doesn't help in terms of development. So black now aggressively puts his knight into the centre in white's half of the board, so it adds a lot of pressure to the position. Takes. And here, I don't like this. I understand that the knight does control a lot of dark squares and central squares, so Nimzowitsch might have thought that removing black's knight in the short term would give him more control of the centre. But I just disagree. I think black has excellent command of the centre here. White's moved his bishop, moved the bishop that's just left the board 3 times and didn't really get anywhere with it. And black's bishops are now even more aggressively pointing towards both the centre and the king side. And just as a point of reference for the endgame, if you have a pair of bishops and your opponent has a knight and a bishop, the 2 bishops are seen as being worth at least half a pawn more because they don't get in each other's way. You know, they're never going to collide with each other or both threaten the same thing. So the coordination is far better than a bishop and a knight, usually anyway. And they control loads more squares than a knight in most cases. And they're just generally, from a psychological point of view, they're much easier to play with because you know what each one's doing. Whereas a bishop and knight can often either neglect half of the squares on the board, where they're both attacking dark squares, for example, and if a knight needs to go onto light squares in this position later on, the white knight would need to be on a dark square to influence the light squares, and that might interfere with the dark squared bishop. So it's much easier to play with opposite coloured bishops. So I don't like this in terms of potential endgames either. Queen c2 is now played. So white's finally, let's say, completes development. I know he hasn't moved the f rook, but the rooks are connected. He's got a rook that's central. The queen's out. I'd say this is pretty much completed development. And now black plays, I think, a very good move. It's a good calculation. Knight takes d2. And it's a little bit unpleasant here for white. What would you play if you were Nimzowitsch here and it was white to move. Well, let's have a look at queen takes d2. Queen takes d2, d4. And here there's the threat of bishop takes f3, doubling white's pawns. But if you play a move like if you move the knight away to e1, I mean, you know, why are you why are you deliberately putting all your pieces on the back row? That's just, you know, allows black to get the initiative. And also, it wouldn't be very nice after d takes e3, because if white captures with the pawn, let's play knight e1. I don't know why we're looking at this, but just to briefly show you, pawn takes, and black, unfortunately, is threatening something horrible. After queen takes, that's the only move, because if pawn takes, bishop takes h2 will win. So queen takes, and black could even just double white's pawns. I mean, I know there's more, but there's queen h4 as well. There are lots and lots of moves here that give black an excellent game. So I don't like this at all. So that's what happened with knight e1. But if e takes d4, then bishop takes f3 is horrible. And if white recaptures, then queen h4. And I can't see a way out of checkmate without losing lots and lots of material. So that wasn't played. Knight takes d2 was played. And what's happened here is that white now, the knight's moved from the protection of the king side to sort of be very passive in the centre. So black has a queen and bishop and another bishop on c6 that are all lined up against the rather defenceless white king. So d4 was played, and that allows the c6 bishop to come to life. And here, what I would play as white would be probably rook fe1. But again, after rook fe8, both sides can now inarguably be said to have completed development. I still feel that white is on the back foot by quite a margin. This doesn't look like a good position to have, but it is preferable to what happened in the game. After d4, e takes was played. And what do you think black played now? Well, queen h4 is interesting, but after, I think, g3, white can just about cling on and survive. So, no, it's not queen h4. There are actually two moves. This is a pattern that you might have seen before. The double bishop sacrifice, and it blasts open white's king side. Well, there are a couple of moves here. The best move, I think, is actually bishop takes g2, and there's the idea of queen g5 is being threatened if black doesn't, if white doesn't take the bishop. So white will take queen g5 anyway, king h1 to try and hide, and queen f4 here is devastating. White has to surrender the material, check, king back to g1. And this is just getting nasty, because after bishop takes h2 check, king h2, the king is totally exposed. So rook d5, and how are you going to prevent rook h5 and then rook h1 mate? Well, take with the queen. And this is very, very nice for black. I would give black at least maybe plus 3 or plus 4 on the computer evaluation. Maybe it's more. But again, it's very, very hard to prevent rook d5 and then rook h5 check. So black is probably going to win another piece. Perhaps white will have to give up a rook or a bishop to prevent checkmate. Anyway, that isn't what happened, but it's worth looking at. So bishop g2 is interesting, but in the game, bishop takes h2 check was played. So white doesn't really have any choice but to take. And now queen h4 check, king g1, and again double bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes g2, and if king takes g2, queen g4, king h2, rook d5 again. So f3 was played, rook fe8, knight moved, and now this is just falling apart for white. Because if rook takes f1, queen h2 check, winning the queen. So instead, white played d5, f5 was played, queen c3 to threaten mate, and here black can just checkmate really quickly with queen g2 check, king e3, rook takes, f takes, e4. And here black actually missed a checkmate in 3. Okay, 10 points you can find it because Tarrasch didn't play it. Yeah, queen g3 check, king d2, queen f2 check, king d1, queen e2 checkmate. But that didn't happen. Here, black played f4, king takes, only move, rook f8, king e5, queen h2 check, king e6. And I think perhaps Tarrasch had seen the earlier mate, but he just wanted to finish it with a flourish because rook e8, king d7, bishop b5, checkmate. So very nice using all the pieces. All right. So hope you got something from this video. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.